Between 2021 and 2022, 3 different research teams published papers claiming they'd made breakthroughs on warp drive. They solved the problems plaguing every sci-fi lover's hopes and dreams. The impossible energy requirements were slashed to completely normal levels. The exotic matter issue was replaced with a positive solution. The radiation buildup would no longer annihilate our welcoming party. Well, that's what the media said they did. But did they? Really? Or was it just like a bit of hype? Today, we're looking at what those papers actually claimed, why they got so much attention, and why they still don't give us warp drive. We'll talk about Lentz's solutions, Babick and Martire's subluminal drives, and Fel and Heisenberg's zero vorticity approach, and then the 2022 paper by Santiago and co. that brings everything back to reality. Now, if you are watching this, then you are on my Patreon or you are a YouTube member, and so you probably know who I am. If you are neither and have no idea, then future me decided to release this to the world, and you are very welcome. I'm Abby, I'm a physicist, and at the moment of recording, I'm writing up my thesis for my PhD at the University of Oxford, so pray for future me. And welcome to my channel. Let's start by reminding ourselves what the warp drive problems are and what these papers were trying to solve. So, Alcubierre's 1994 paper showed that you could mathematically construct a method of effective faster-than-light travel by warping space-time. You compress the space in front, you expand it behind, and you surf the geometry. The ship itself sits inside a bubble of flat space-time, while the space-time outside moves around it. It's mathematically valid, a proper solution to Einstein's field equations. And still, the problems are many, but we're going to focus on the 2 that the papers I mentioned hoped to solve. First is that it requires an enormous amount of energy, and a substantial amount of that needs to have a negative energy density. Basically, act on space-time as if it has negative mass. Like, do the opposite of what everything in the universe does to space-time. Which, of course, sounds impossible. Now, the weird thing is that we have observed negative energy densities in quantum effects like the Casimir effect. But it's not the same thing as having negative mass that you can, like, collect and use. And even if it were, the scale is freaking absurd. The Casimir effect produces forces in the piconewtons, and warp drive needs so much negative energy that the best way for people to describe it is to convert the entire planet of Jupiter. Even if you could scale up the Casimir experiment, you would need to build conducting plates the size of the solar system to be able to produce the amount of negative energy between them. And that's just being like really kind of loose description of it. We cannot scale it like that. Now, the second main problem is that even if you had exotic matter, you'd need impossible amounts of conventional energy on top of that. For 25 years, the consensus has been warp drives are mathematically interesting, but physically impossible. Now, over the years, many people have tried to solve this, so let's talk about them. Starting with Eric Lentz's soliton solution. In March 2021, Eric Lentz published a paper in the journal Classical and Quantum Gravity called Breaking the Warp Barrier, Hyperfast Solitons in Einstein-Maxwell Plasma Theory. The main claim here is that you could build warp drives using only positive energy. No exotic matter was required. And he did this by using solitons. Well, really it was soliton-like mathematical structures. Let me explain what that means. So in physics, a soliton is a special kind of wave. Normal waves spread out and fade as they move. Like if you drop a stone in some water, the ripples will get wider and weaker as they travel. But solitons don't. They're self-reinforcing waves that hold their shape indefinitely. and we can see them in nature. Certain ocean waves can travel for miles without changing form. Light pulses in fiber optic cables maintain their shape using soliton properties. Now, they exist because of a balance. The wave wants to spread out, but the properties of the medium that it is moving through push back and keep it together. So, solitons exist in a medium, as in a physical material, and this balance of how this material responds is what lets them keep their shape and their energy. Lentz's paper is talking about space-time. So the normal rules of how a soliton behaves can't apply here because there's no material. Lentz wasn't talking about waves traveling through space-time. He was talking about arranging matter and energy into soliton-like patterns. And these patterns would curve space-time into the warp bubble geometry using only conventional positive energy. It's not a soliton in space-time, it's a soliton-like configuration of the stuff that makes space-time curve. Whether this is physically meaningful or just clever mathematics is an open question. We have no idea how you'd actually create and maintain these configurations in reality. But on paper, it looked promising. It solves kinda one big problem with warp drive, the exotic matter problem. No more negative energy needed. Fantastic. You just need good old-fashioned positive energy. So what's the catch? First, the energy requirements actually increased by a lot. Alcubierre needed 1 Jupiter mass of exotic matter. Lentz needs hundreds of Jupiter masses of conventional energy. Now, some estimates suggest thousands, depending on the configuration. We've traded an impossible material for an even more impossible energy requirement. Secondly, even if you had that energy, we don't know how to arrange it into these soliton-like configurations. We don't know how to create them, how to stabilize them, how to maintain them while you're traveling. It's completely speculative. Lentz's work is interesting mathematics. It proves exotic matter isn't specifically required to create the geometry that you need, but it doesn't make warp drive achievable. It's really important to point out here that these are solutions to equations. They're not physical realities. All this is saying is you can write down on paper something that aligns with Einstein's equations and says that this type of a geometry could exist. But it's not a recipe for how to actually create that type of geometry. And this is the same problem with all of them. It's interesting maths. It's not an actual, hey, we can make this if you just figure out the energy requirements or the engineering constraints. Anyway, moving on. About a month after Lentz's paper in April 2021, Babick and Martire published Introducing Physical Warp Drives in the same journal, Classical and Quantum Gravity. Their approach was different. They said, maybe the problem is trying to go faster than light. So what if we aim a bit lower? What if we build subluminal warp drives, warp bubbles that move slower than light but use only positive energy? Now, you might be thinking, what's the point of a slower than light warp drive? And you'd probably be right to ask that. But their argument was, if you could prove the concept works at subluminal speeds with positive energy, maybe you could scale it up later. And that's how a lot of science works. So they developed a general framework for spherically symmetric warp drives. Now, this idea was you have 3 regions. The flat space inside, where the passengers sit. You have a curved shell around that, creating the warp effect. And then you have flat space far away, all powered by positive energy density. Now, on paper, this sounds like progress because there's no call for exotic matter and no faster than light speeds causing causality problems. Just a mathematically consistent warp bubble moving through space. So what's the problem? When you really look at the details, their version doesn't actually move. Their equations describe a nice curved pocket of space-time, but it just sits there. Nothing travels anywhere. Now, in their simplest case, the spherical version, the whole thing is effectively static. It looks a bit like a standing ripple. It's interesting geometry, again, absolutely, but no motion. And when you apply all of their own conditions, it kind of flattens out to something that's basically normal, unwarped spacetime. Now, they also argued that Alcubierre's original design couldn't change speed, that accelerating the bubble would break the physics. That's not quite right. Now, you can include acceleration in Alcubierre's setup. You just have to supply the energy that would cause that acceleration. It's not free, but it's not forbidden either. Now, Babick and Martire were trying to be careful. Their goal wasn't to design a working engine. It was to put warp drives on firmer mathematical ground and build a general framework. Other researchers could then use it later. It makes sense to start with a simpler case and then build from there. Like I said, that's what a lot of science does. But their specific examples don't produce a functioning warp drive, even at slower than light speeds. The space-time they describe doesn't actually carry a ship anywhere. It just reshapes the geometry and just sits there. You'd need to add propulsion if you want it to move. And, as we'll soon see, even if they had managed to make it move, it would still run into the same fundamental roadblocks that all the others have. In July 2021, Sebastian Fel and Heisenberg published their paper on what they called positive energy warp drives from hidden geometric structures, also published in the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity. Now, their idea focused on something called vorticity. In fluid dynamics, vorticity measures how much a flow twists or swirls. So like water spinning down a drain has high vorticity. Water flowing straight through a pipe has 0. They applied the same idea to space-time. Imagine space-time itself as a kind of flowing fabric around the warp bubble. Most warp drive designs allow that to flow, to twist, to shear in complicated ways. Fel and Heisenberg asked, what if you make it perfectly smooth? What if space-time flows without any rotation at all, 0 vorticity? When you force space-time to behave that neatly, the equations simplify pretty dramatically. And in those simplified equations, the energy density, the amount of energy you'd need to curve space-time that way, can look positive instead of negative. Now, on paper, that sounded like a breakthrough, a warp drive geometry with no exotic matter, only normal positive energy. But as always, you guys, there's a catch. You see, 0 vorticity space-time is an ideal scenario. We're talking spherical chickens in a vacuum. Real systems are never that tidy. Any realistic attempt to create or move a warp bubble would no doubt involve rotation or asymmetry of some kind. And as soon as you allow that nice, neat behavior disappears. Even if you could somehow keep the flow perfectly smooth, you'd still need astronomical amounts of energy arranged in an incredibly precise pattern. But still, using this geometry makes it look as though the positive energy problem is solved. But only if you look at the bubble from one very special perspective, moving exactly with it. And it turns out that this is the problem that all of these papers have. If a design only works when seen from one specific point of view, it probably doesn't work at all. In March 2022, Jessica Santiago, Sebastian Schuster, and Matt Visser published Generic Warp Drives Violate the Null Energy Condition, and they published in the journal Physical Review D. To understand what they showed, we need a quick reminder of what energy conditions are. So energy conditions are the universe's rule book for how matter and energy are allowed to behave. They're not just like arbitrary limits. They come from what we've seen every type of normal matter do. So in simple terms, energy has to act like energy. It can't suddenly go negative in ways that break gravity or causality. The most important of these rules is called the null energy condition. It says that for every possible way that you could move through space-time, the energy you measure can't be negative. It's one of the safeguards that keeps physics behaving sensibly. Without it, you can get things like wormholes, time loops, and other paradoxes, which sounds fun, but it just doesn't work with, what we know. So here's why the 2021 papers don't give us warp drive. You see, Lentz, Babick and Martire, and Fel and Heisenberg all checked their energy conditions from just one very specific point of view, the perspective of someone sitting perfectly still relative to the warp bubble. From that viewpoint, everything looks fine. No negative energy, no problem. But the laws of physics don't depend on where you're sitting or how you're moving. They have to hold for every possible point of view. So Santiago's team tested these warp drive designs from all directions and all speeds, the full range of perspectives that the universe allows. And when they did this, the illusion disappeared. For many of those other viewpoints, the energy turned negative again. The warp drive geometries violated every major energy condition: null, weak, strong, dominant. And this time, the problem wasn't with the type of matter you used. The violation, it comes from the geometry itself, from the way space-time has to bend to make the bubble move. Even if you fill the universe with normal, positive energy material, the shape of the warp field would still break the rules. In short, Santiago and her colleagues showed that this isn't a problem you can fix with clever maths or with new materials. It's baked into the very shape of the space-time itself.
Scotty, I can't change the laws of physics.
So where does that leave us in 2025, or at the end of 2025? The scientific consensus is clear. Warp drives violate fundamental energy conditions, and this has been confirmed for every proposed design. Alcubierre's original and all the 2021 variants. Even if you had exotic matter in hand, enough of it arranged perfectly, the resulting warp bubble geometry would still violate the energy conditions. The exotic matter doesn't cause the violation. The curved space-time does. Some physicists argue that we should explore modified gravity theories where energy conditions might work differently. Others suggest quantum effects at the Planck scale might permit violations that we don't understand yet. But with the physics that we do understand today, warp drives are fundamentally ruled out, you guys. The 2021 papers got so much attention because they seemed to offer hope, and also because, the media loves hype. Positive energy, no exotic matter, NASA headlines. Don't get me wrong, they're all interesting physics, they're all new approaches. But we have to remember that just because we can make it work mathematically doesn't mean we can make it work physically. When we work with theory, we develop equations that we hope are testable. We place conditions and boundaries, we set specific parameters. Basically, we say, if the universe is like this, then a shape like this can exist. But that doesn't mean a shape like this can be constructed. It's simply saying that there's no explicit rule that says that it can't exist. But in the case of these papers, the universe that they use is not reflective of the universe we live in. It's a version of the universe, set for a very specific case. But to create anything, it has to work for all cases, unfortunately. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope more than anything that it is clear, because it's a tricky one. Let me know what you think about all of this. Now, I never want to spoil the fun and the excitement of sci-fi. Things change all the time, and only the future can really tell what will become of us. While it's fun to speculate, I just don't think that it helps when work like this is taken out of context and spread so wildly through viral content and media headlines. See, most people will jump on it just for clicks, and I get why. But it makes my job like 10 times harder, because it's almost impossible to talk about any of this stuff without being like corrected by those who have misunderstood this kind of research or been misled about what it actually means by content creators and science influencers who they themselves don't actually understand it. I dream about us having a better future, of fantastic technology and exciting exploration. Of course I do. I love me some sci-fi. But I also think it's important to follow the real research that we currently have and the work that we're doing to know where we should be putting our focus and what real advancements we're making that we should be excited about, but might not be as like fancy as a big old flashy warp drive. Personally, look, this is just me. I don't believe we'll ever have something like a warp drive. Not because of causality, not because of negative energy, but because of practicality, you guys. There are not enough resources in the entire solar system to build one. We need to look elsewhere and leave warp to Star Trek. Maybe the OG warp, like maybe, you know, going into subspace is a better bet for our future, if it's real. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon with a new topic. Stay nerdy.